Lynch. Harlan County abounds with every breed of tall tale, from Bigfoot stories to legends about ghostly miners. They're just overshadowed by the mine wars and the coal country mythology of the early 1900s. Only the locals really hear tell of things which go bump in the night, and even then, the hardy and hard-headed folk in the hollers are cautious about sharing them with outsiders. Too often, the traveling lowlander or coastal visitor already looks down his nose at the accents and the poverty and familial simplicity of Appalachia. Thus, the people of Harlan County aren't too keen on handing the outsiders more ammunition for their disdain. I grew up in those parts, though, and I heard my share of campfire stories in the dark of the craggy forests and vine-choked glens of home. I recall one story about lights tracing mountain tops held to be deserted in the dead of quiet summer nights, the ghastly lanterns, so it was said, of long-dead moonshiners whose stills had not run for many a decade. That was a favorite for my grandparents, and I'd had it told to me a dozen times before the age of 10, so the local tradition runs deep. There were tales of ghostly echoes of mine collapses, and reports of strange voices in the woods at night, and even a legend about a gigantic snake seen tracing the creek bottoms of Harlan. Even at that young age, most of those hill myths didn't hold much stock in my eyes, and for reasons that will become obvious as I tell this story, I've never assumed anyone else would put much stock in my experience either. This will be the first time I've told anyone, barring my sister, I suppose, what really happened to me in the winter of 2007. Even then, with family as my only witness, I held back on imparting some of the weird little intricacies which have kept me wondering ever since. As the years passed, I failed time and again to escape the sensation that everything I saw was real, that my experience was genuine. I've recently stumbled across certain myths about subterranean cave things, ranging the map from West Virginia to Wales, and that has me more convinced than ever it was genuine. So, I'm recording that experience here, to put my thoughts in order and, perhaps, find a little peace. Having finished the first semester of my senior year at Pikeville about 2 weeks earlier, I'd driven back home to be with my then fiancée, who had a place she shared with her sisters in the tiny town of Lynch. There's a shadow that hangs low over that town. It's hard to put a finger on what exactly casts it, or trace exactly how, but something puts people off about the place. It has all the worldly charm of any other hill town, and possesses enough buildings in antique styles to draw more antiquarian hearts together, but it lacks even modest businesses, and can't boast the liveliness of its small-town neighbors. The mines have mostly turned to low-traffic tourist traps, and with them the lifeblood of the town has ceased to flow. With prospects slim and skeletal, those antiquated homes slip into neglect as the population ages or trickles away for better employment elsewhere. After 2 or 3 decades of struggle, Lynch might as well be an empty, rattling old set piece, its few hangers-on the last desperate performers in some monotonous, long-doomed theatrical tragedy. Perhaps the worst of all are the toothy ridges of almost scorched coal tipples and storage barns which dot the ridges looming tall over the huddled, decaying homes and bent ruins of Lynch's forgotten Main Street. From the valley floor amongst those hills, they look almost like lost towers left by some age-torn, vanished civilization. In a way, I suppose they are. Townspeople living in their shadow can't help but be tugged back into worried wonder about the future of jobs and livelihoods in the region every time their eyes find one of the tottering pillars. The companies, all owned by men in the distant northeast, had long ago grown fat on the black gold beneath the earth, and had either moved to more profitable fare elsewhere, or mechanized, and cut free working people to rot in places just like this. The coal tipples aren't much different than abandoned Roman aqueducts, and the beleaguered Kentuckians in their shadow look up at them with all the nostalgic hope and wonder which Dark Age peasants must once have felt in distant Europe. I'd been swept out of my fiancé's home that December, my terrible and long-plagued relationship collapsing in the thundering, caustic way typical of disaster pairs like that one. I'd been not so ceremoniously urged into the near-freezing rain that night after the spectacular shouted conclusion to our fighting, stumbling under the weight of 2 duffel bags hastily filled into the wet and wind. Perky despite the weather and the prologue to this ill-fated trip was Saul, my old collie, who kept dutiful watch over my bunched clothing and valuables while I took up my phone on the tattered sidewalk of tattered Main Street to call up my mother across the state in Indiana, just west of Louisville. My parents had abandoned this rickety ship a few years prior, and I begged them for a ride, despite the late hour and the miserable weather. My wallet had been left in the bedroom, and it would have been disastrous to return for it then, with the coven of sisters stalking the halls of that run-down house like spiteful ghouls. With the weather as bad as it was, a walk along 20 miles of road to friends in Harlan proper wasn't on the menu either. My options were few, and my worries were many. In the moment, I didn't care how desperate I must have sounded over the phone. I just wanted escape. Tucked under the awning of a long-closed company store with Saul at my side, my heart sunk. As the wind lashed down the street, my mother, despite her worry, told me she was nearly 4 hours further away in Indianapolis, visiting an aunt. Just my luck. By the time we'd exchanged goodbyes and hung up, the whipping of the awning in the wind and the gnaw of the rain through my already damp sneakers made me vow I'd find somewhere to warm myself. Though I didn't think it was cold enough to kill me through all my layers, it was far less than comfortable in my sorry condition, and I figured escaping this chill might ward off the sinking of my spirits. I got up, hoisted my bags, and went on my way, with Saul lurking at my heels and my duffel bags left to sit near an old newspaper dispenser out front. I poked into the lone gas station left standing in town. It was a weary local affair, nearly a decade in its grave, but the woman at the register was kind enough. She permitted me to sit along the wall of the alcove entryway, with my companion curled at my side. That wasn't a king's perch, but I could at least keep free of the wind. I was left to watch the non-existent traffic and burn time for a few hours, solitary stragglers out for beer or cigarettes occasionally striding over my outstretched legs as they pushed into the station. Last call came around, though, if it can be called that, and as my hostess went about locking up the final store drawing breath in this strangled hamlet, she told me with some guilt that I would have to find somewhere else to wait out my remaining hours in Lynch. Scooping up my belongings and moving back off into the wind outside my modest hideaway took a great deal more effort than it had taken to flee the house, and I needed to summon up every ounce of my stubborn determination to muster the will to march out again. Saul's company helped, but even his friendly presence stood as a reminder that we couldn't stay wandering for the fully 4 or 5 hours which stood between us and rescue. I needed to find somewhere both secure and sheltered, and I thought I knew of just the place. When youth was still driving me to reckless adventure, the woods just north of town had offered up somewhere which was both close to home and bright enough not to drive me mad in the clouded night. An old coal processing plant's ruin crouched low in the trees just beyond town up there, its gnarled bulk cutting into the slope of its hosting hill. The place's face was a great wall of paneled glass, but long years and the predations of the town's children had left the surface craggy and sparse, the remnants catching the high beams of passing cars in the murk of the valley and briefly giving life to the shadow-doomed forest. The old coal plant had long been a fortress for the children of the region. The remoteness of the community prevented it from becoming too common a squat for drifters or the homeless, while the concrete, almost Soviet bulk of the ancient-looking edifice drew the imaginations of even grown souls into its tenebrous depths. Several nights over my last summer in town as a high schooler had been spent testing my nerves with friends in that very building. It stood not 100 yards from the main road through a thin span of trees and across a long, dry, and broken stone channel, through which a diverted creek had once run. Despite its age, the plant was dry, and though the rust and the shoddy construction would have made it a bad permanent residence, I wasn't in the market for a house just yet. This was my last shot at a sheltered retreat, and afforded me a good view of the station and the main road not far off from its vantage point on the hill. Texting my mother my plan and making certain she knew to stop at the gas station and wait for me there, Saul and I pressed on up the road a short way and over the channel. Fences had long been tumbled over, and any police in the county had better cases to crack than trespassers in modest, forgotten Lynch. So we had little to worry about as I used my phone's wavering light to press through the worst of the brush on the opposing side of the trench. At length, we came below the plant. It was raised on mighty concrete stilts to better stand on the incline, one of Harlan County's finest coal castles. Its moldering smell, that of rust and industrial decay, which carries an almost sweet aerosol taste and scent on the wind under the right conditions, was so strong as to be overpowering, and a grand whiff of the stuff stopped me in my tracks as I reached the clearing around its pillared feet. It would likely have been 5 stories or so measured from its real floor to the ceiling, but the interior was mostly one great open space, stripped of most of the machinery which had powered Lynch in days of old. It boasted only 2 floors of rickety metal walkways encircling the room's edges, both so fragile in their old age as to be entirely untrustworthy. I believe it was these battered walkways I heard creaking in the whiny way that elderly steel murmurs and groans in the wind and the cold, and I hesitated. Even though the night was bright despite the rain, and the road through the trees occasionally lit the place with the beams of passing headlights, this forgotten fortress was still foreboding enough to give me pause. Saul sniffed around at my side, but didn't wander far, seeming wary of the strange place, and the noises emanating from the rainy woods all around it. Eventually, though, the wind and rain began to bite again, and the minutes spent apprehensive in the cold seemed more and more painful. I find it funny that I might have avoided years of worry and nightmare if that rain had just shoved off for a night or two when we needed to be outside. As it was, Saul and I needed a roof over our heads, and I let us in. Aged stairways and ladders leading up into the monolith had almost all rotten away, but the last survivor, a shoddy flight of switchback metal gone to seed long ago, was sturdy enough to hold us. I was careful to ensure Saul didn't entangle a paw in the grated surface, or slice a leg on the ragged edges which seemed to lurk everywhere, seeking vulnerable skin to gash and gnaw. Once inside, though, the metal gave way to concrete, and the only worry was the trailer-sized opening in the center of the room's concrete floor. An old tipping point for trucks driving beneath the building, perhaps. The ragged wires and tethers hanging above that waiting mouth in the floor dangled like twisted intestines in the dim and dust. Its sparse railing would keep me from tumbling if I needed to pace for warmth in the darkness, and though I initially worried for Saul, he wasn't one for straying and exploring. Dripping from the few holes in the blessedly intact metal roof echoed all about the bowels of the building, while the wind shuddered through the creaking windows and metal fixtures all around, to create an almost total ambiance of wretched age and dreariness. The seedy opera of industrial forgetfulness only barely outpaced the world outside in the realm of comfort, and, dour as he was, Saul seemed just as aware of the somber atmosphere as I was. Striding over to find a seat down among the stone and scattered brick near the building's broken glass face, I kept my back to one of the paired concrete columns along the wall, so that I could face the split farther above on the far wall, the truly frightening part of the building. That dark opening, whose blackness against the fluttering evening gloom of the main chamber reminded me what real darkness could look like, was the entryway to an old and battered coal tipple. Its busy conveyor belt had, in days past, carried coal from a mine nearly a mile off over the mountain into sorting facilities up the hill. After this, the belt would carry the load the rest of the way down, bringing its payload to rest here. A tunnel of dingy wood and banded rust soaring high above the forest undergrowth of the hills it was, climbing up and away as if to flee the rotting facility. Once it had played host to my friends and I, climbing along the shifty stairways and ladders that flanked the long-dead conveyor, and sneaking around the sorting facility uphill, each of us laughing at our daring. Alone, I was not so cocky. Under the pressure of the winds, I could hear its groaning wooden bulk join the symphonic creaks of the plant all around me. Even if only bats haunted that dark and winding tunnel into the hills, I didn't trust it enough to leave my back to it. 2 hours in the catacombs of Lynch's coal industry was not long, but it felt long. Noise never let me fully rest in the dark, and as glad as I was to find myself dry and relatively warm, everything about the place seemed different now that I was here without the playful voices of friends to reassure me. Years hadn't done more than add graffiti and trash to the place, but everything down to the sickly scent of metal moving fast towards rot kept me from just drifting off into my thoughts. Every car's light cast through the window sent me on a quick scan of the floor all around me for unseen rats or insects, which I knew better than to look for in this kind of wet weather at this time of year. All the while Saul's head stayed at attention, his head twitching and bobbing back and forth now and again, as he too scanned and sniffed for something amiss which he couldn't place from his seat at my side. Somehow, that put me off, Saul acting funny. He even strayed off a few times towards the loading bay at the room's center with his nose to the ground, only returning begrudgingly when I called to him through the softly swirling dust haze of that awful room. Never before had I seen him act that way, and even though part of me wanted to push it off on being in a new place filled with strange sights and sounds, I didn't ever fully get over it. When, at length, the sound which spooked me echoed out from the far corner of the room, I'd almost been ready to leave. It had been a bit over 2 hours, and I was starting to think the last little while out in the cold would be bearable if I could just find a pine with a bit of growth left over to sit under. or beg a porch seat off the kind of midnight smokers you seem only to find in run-down neighborhoods. Again, it strikes me how close I might have come to missing this experience entirely. But I didn't. When the chain rigging up against the walls of that far corner shifted and grated in a way unfamiliar to me after an hour in the plant, I froze and found the corner, eyes narrowing in the dark. Saul rose even as I shifted my head and got to my feet, rising slowly to his own full height and making cautiously in the direction of the gap in the floor and the offending chain beyond, ears flat. I made no sound, and neither did he. I remember thinking how odd it was that he seemed interested, nervous about the sound, but didn't so much as growl on the approach. This was the same dog who barked for an hour at squirrels and deer through windows towards our backyard, and yet he was crouched low, eerily quiet, eyes wide and locked on that spot from whence the clanking motion of metal on stone had come. For all my worry, though, I could see nothing. I could identify only the slightest shape against the bulk of the mounded chains and the grunge of the dirtied walls in the gloom. Even then I was uncertain, for though I didn't remember having glimpsed this pile of stone or blotchy patch of aged paint before, I told myself it was surely too still in those long seconds we spent staring at it to be a living thing. My hand lingered on my phone, but I didn't dare power the screen on to bring light to the room. The chamber was far too large for the phone to entirely banish the dark. Even more worrying was the moment of blindness flipping the thing around and getting the screen up to full brightness would cause me. Even while I was busy wrapping myself in reasons the shape I was seeing couldn't be anything other than an odd pattern along the wall, I remember just as vividly that I didn't dare take my eyes off it. Pin it on instinct if you want, but I'd wager it was just the paranoia of the hour prior actually paying off as I encountered something odd in the coal plant. A blind grasp of luck, the hour's twitchy disposition gracefully granted its guest. Cautious as Saul before me, I lifted myself up to full height from my half-crouched stoop, eyes still wide and fixed, and after another moment spent waiting for motion which didn't come, I fortified myself as best I could and took a soft step forward which rung out as thunderous despite the battering of the rain outside. Then, after maybe half a minute, Saul did growl, long and low. Heart racing all the faster, I suddenly found my voice calling, "Hello?" Nothing. Motionless. Saul's growl died away, but he renewed it as soon as he'd taken another breath, beginning to pick his way out and around the gap in the floor, eyes ever locked on the corner, ever slower and lower to the ground in his stalking, almost feline prowl. I called again, but once more no one replied, and no flicker of motion stirred the shadows. Just as I gathered my breath to call Saul back, the fleeting light of a passing car along Lynch's main road punctured the woods and threw itself upon the splintered window panels at my back. And what the dancing light revealed in that crypt of coal was not just a spot along the wall or an unseen pile of debris. I can only be thankful I caught just the fleeting glimpse I did, but that's a small comfort. I don't know what it was. The years have painted it stranger and stranger in my memories, but at the time, I thought it was a human being. Even so, it was massive, nearly twice my height. Even if time and fear make people exaggerate, I'd say at least 8 feet, and probably bigger. Lean to the point it was painful to look at. Gnarled and bony like a Holodomor peasant grasping for grain. Long in the arms and legs in a revolting way, which was hard to tolerate. It had these horrible, long, crab-leg-jointed fingers splayed out on the wall behind it. It was white against the gray of the stone, and though I can't be sure, I'm certain as I reflect it was hanging perched against the wall, inches from the ground and motionless amidst the chains as it balanced on the wall. The most troubling were the eyes, massive, staring, glinting amber and fish-like in the black as the light outside died away and plunged us back into ink and obscurity. The brightness was what seemed to jolt it, though it didn't move until after the dark had rushed in on us again. I'm not too proud to say I didn't have the first thought of fighting or running as it lurched. I was too shocked, too busy trying to sort out what was in front of me to worry about what it might be here for. And before I knew it, the thing had vaulted, almost flown into a roll from the wall. Saul had begun backing up as soon as the light had hit it, but he hadn't gotten far, and whatever it was moved so fast and had such long reach. Poor thing. I know it grabbed him, but as often as I find myself rising from nightmares and shaking at the memory, I don't know whether he yelped, or whether it all happened too quickly for him to feel pain or fear. Speed and the jerky, almost jittery way the thing moved made it a blur in the dancing light through the glass, and by the time I knew what was happening, it was leaping and climbing spider-like up to the ring of rusted walkways above, and dashing for the tipple chute up the mountain set into the wall, Saul's limp form under its arm. He never made a sound. I don't know why I followed them. I don't know what I thought I could do to save him. Like a young kid misjudging the depth of a pond, I was in over my head before I considered the consequences. I have no memory of the grapple for the upper walkway along a shoddy ladder, or my pursuit up the tipple, though I must in retrospect have used my phone in the blackness along the wooden tunnel. Disturbing as it is to say now as I reflect on it, the darkness was almost cave-like in that tipple, a subterranean chute filled with aged equipment and the scattered remnants of coal floating paradoxically above the earth. Just as it occurred to me how hard it would be to get back down, just as it occurred to me that I'd heard neither the pale thing nor Saul in all this time, I found myself in the elongated mountaintop sorting center I'd visited all those years ago with my friends. My phone tossed light off of several battered electrical panels whose innards were as ravaged as the glass at the floor of the plant. No windows graced its walls, for it was just wide enough for the conveyor and a walkway to either side, and just tall enough to allow for corroded bridges to pass over the belt. Structural archways every few yards and the interrupting bulk of metal hanging above the conveyor strangled my light, making it all the more insignificant. A boat at the edge of the deep sea, waiting to disappear in some sudden and unforeseen storm. Though I desperately wanted to find Saul, I had to have known even back in the plant that he was either gone or as good as gone. His silence spoke as much. Despite that, in my doomed run up the chute, I had all but stranded myself, overinvested and charged far too deep into dangerous terrain in the dark. I had no plan to escape, and no guarantee whatever took Saul was not preparing to turn around and come back for more. Death skulked here, I remember thinking, whether I wanted to turn back or not. What did I have to lose? A human skeleton, buried in ragged clothing and coal dust, which leaned against the first arch, shattered that do-or-die recklessness, though. I didn't see much detail, but what I did see was more than enough to spook me back into the chute and down towards the plant, crawling and tumbling as best I could in the murk. In a blur, I burst through the plant, down the battered walkway and into the woods beyond. never once looking over my shoulder, but ever expecting a long-fingered hand to jerk me up by the coat and drag me back up the mountain towards the sorting facility and the abandoned mines farther on. I called my mother as I stumbled back onto Main Street and made for the comparative light of the gas station. Store hours and courtesy be damned. She answered, and I babbled all the confused and frightened pleas to hurry I could muster over the phone, half in tears, my eyes often seeking out the looming tombstone that was the coal plant. It, in turn, looked with storied, eternal vigilance down over the town. Once I was certain she was close, I phoned the police, reserved enough, even in my crazed worry, not to mention my encounter with the thing in the coal plant's ruin. The skeletal remains in the sorting facility and my missing dog, run away in the dark in this censored narrative, were all I revealed to them, and that was enough to get a car from the county sheriff out to town. For a while I was certain the deputies who arrived first that night were going to drag me up the mountain and into the bowels of that hellish complex again to show them the way, but their superiors later accepted my desperate pleas that I'd be taken to a hospital. I was concussed and bleeding profusely from a gash I'd given myself running headlong into a fallen metal support bar in the tipple coming down, and that saved me from the return trip. My mother had me out and away from there, en route to an emergency room not an hour after the police arrived and garnered what information I could give them. I've never been so happy or comfortable at a hospital. That night was the last time I looked on Lynch, save through the lens of nightmare, for I haven't returned, and don't plan to. Childhood memories and affectionate internal overtures towards home might soften that feeling, but the ongoing and likely futile investigation into that skeletal body found in the ruin will ever serve as a barrier to my return. Reports from the coroner cited hyoid fractures as evidence of foul play, and the Harlan County authorities to this day lay the death of the transient whose remains were found in the sorting facility at the feet of an unknown killer in the region or beyond, perhaps a transient like the dead man himself. Tumbles and scuffles over lighters, alcohol, or dry socks have led to worse, they attest, bringing case after case forth to bolster their point. Whatever the truth, a year prior to my encounter, on a winter night much like the one upon which he was found, that skeleton had been throttled in the dark up above Lynch, as he lurked far from the wind and the prying eyes of the citizens of the sleepy, desiccated mining town. What they haven't placed a motive on, though, are the odd marks driven into the bone along the legs, where the all-weather pants have been violently ripped and torn away. Wounds which suggest stripping of the flesh by way of blade, tooth, or claw. Answers to their questions are slim, and their searches through the complex have revealed little save the mine and its treacherous half-flooded interior levels, inaccessible by all but the most daring spelunkers and divers. Who knows what dwells in those bowels of the earth, feeding on all that which dares come into its shadow? It was relatively recently, consumed by nightmares about that night in the coal plant, that I stumbled across an article on the Ogof, a cave in Wales, where strange sightings, sounds, and disappearances abound. That mythology got me searching, and I found a similar mythos of moon-eyed people and pale figures left by the Shawnee and Cherokee in our own mountains. What's more, I stumbled across disappearances in the caves dotting the state, from Pine Hill to sprawling Mammoth Cave further west. This made me revisit the memory in detail, made me write it down in full here, made me remember things I hadn't ever considered connecting to that awful night in Lynch before. I've found myself revisiting a youthful event whose weight I didn't realize until now, with many years and miles between me and the mountains. In my youth, on a forgotten afternoon, elementary school had let out, and a close childhood friend, Mamie, had taken me out to see the coal plant. It was my first visit to the ruin, the beginning of my many trespasses as I grew. Altogether it had been an uneventful trip, clouded with all the haziness and lethargy youthful recollections are prone to. But I seem to recall there having been at least one memorable development on that much warmer afternoon all those years prior. It creeps back into the cellar of my awareness now, to knock around and remind me of things which would have been better left forgotten. As we left the empty coal plant and walked along the creek bed late that afternoon, Mamie had realized she'd left her backpack behind and had doubled back into the plant to retrieve it. Both of us knew her mother would be furious if her school supplies were all left to meditate in the ruin, so I let her go and diligently continued flipping over rocks and collecting bugs on the creek shore. Upon Mamie's return minutes later, we set off up the embankment and walked off along the road home, conversations lost to my mind carrying us along in the steady, careless way childish discourse so beautifully manages. When rounding the bend onto our dead-end road, though, she offered up a question that, even all these years later, stands my hairs on end. She casually asked me whether I'd spotted the scarecrow hung up in the wiry steel rafters of the shadowy plant, and speculated as to who in our small community would have been bold enough to climb up to such daring heights and stash yard art along the ceiling. At the time, and for years afterward, I'd forgotten those words. Now I'm inclined to wonder. While I'm still trying to track Mamie down after years of broken contact, I can't help but think she too might have been watched that evening as the sun set, and she efficiently trotted back for her school pack. It's almost as consuming a subject to dwell on as my own experience. How long did the thing in the corner share the room with me? Was it motionless throughout, missed as an unsmooth surface along the old wall until attention had been called directly to it? Or had it crept in and slid down the wall to observe or perhaps listen to us from its perch? If so, for how long? From what crag or crevice in the mine and caves beyond the tipple had it come? Worst of all, was it alone?